The cafeteria tray flew through the air in slow motion, spinning end over end as mashed potatoes and green beans scattered like confetti across the polished linoleum floor. Chen watched it happen with the detached calm of someone who had seen violence coming from 3 moves away, her body already shifting into the defensive stance that had been drilled into her muscle memory since she was 6 years old. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The tray clattered to the ground with a metallic crash that echoed through the suddenly silent Jefferson High cafeteria. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, Maya made a decision that would change everything. The boy standing over her, all 6 feet of entitled swagger and carefully styled brown hair, had no idea that the quiet new girl he'd just humiliated had spent the last 11 years training in 3 different martial arts disciplines under one of the most respected senseis in the country. Brandon Walsh, star quarterback and self-appointed king of Jefferson High's social hierarchy, was about to learn a lesson that no amount of his father's money could buy. Maya had arrived at Jefferson High School 3 weeks ago on a gray October morning, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of discipline most teenagers couldn't imagine. Her family had moved to Millbrook, Connecticut from San Francisco after her mother landed a position as head librarian at the local community college, a job that paid half what she'd earned in California, but offered something more valuable than money, stability, and a fresh start. The Chen family had been running from something, though Maya never spoke about it openly. Her father, David Chen, had been a respected martial arts instructor who owned a successful dojo in San Francisco's Richmond district. Students came from across the Bay Area to train under his guidance, drawn by his reputation for producing champions, and his philosophy that martial arts were about building character, not just fighting skills. Maya had grown up on the training mats, learning discipline and respect alongside devastating techniques that could disable an opponent in seconds. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday evening when Maya was 15. Her father was closing the dojo late, counting the day's receipts and preparing for the next morning's classes, when 3 men entered through the back door. They wore expensive suits and spoke with the kind of authority that came from never being told no. They represented certain business interests in Chinatown, they explained, and her father's dojo was operating in territory that required protection. The monthly fee was reasonable, they assured him, especially considering the unfortunate accidents that sometimes befell unprotected businesses. David Chen had spent his entire life teaching his students to stand up to bullies, to protect the innocent, and to never compromise their principles for convenience or safety. He looked these men in the eye and told them exactly what they could do with their protection racket. The beating that followed left him in the hospital for 2 weeks, with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a shattered left wrist that would never fully heal. The police investigation went nowhere, as everyone knew it would. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia, security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned, and the 3 men seemed to have vanished into the fog that perpetually shrouded San Francisco. But the message was clear: pay or face the consequences. When David Chen returned to his dojo, he found his windows smashed, his equipment destroyed, and a note explaining that next time they might not be so gentle. That's when Linda Chen made the decision that would uproot their entire life. She applied for library positions across the country, looking for somewhere small and safe where they could rebuild without looking over their shoulders. Millbrook, Connecticut seemed perfect. A quiet suburban town where the biggest crime was teenagers spray painting the water tower, and the most dangerous thing Maya would face was deciding between different college prep courses. Maya understood why her mother needed the safety of anonymity, but she also understood what they'd lost in the process. Her father's spirit had been broken along with his bones, and the proud sensei who had once commanded respect from students and competitors alike now worked security at a shopping mall, his injured wrist a constant reminder of the price of standing up for what was right. The dojo that had been their family's legacy, their connection to their heritage, and their primary source of income was gone, sold for a fraction of its worth to pay medical bills and moving expenses. Jefferson High School represented everything Maya had learned to navigate carefully. It was a world of privilege and politics where image mattered more than integrity, where the right last name or zip code could excuse almost any behavior, and where kids who had never faced real adversity wielded their inherited advantages like weapons against anyone they perceived as different or weak. Maya's strategy was simple: keep her head down, maintain perfect grades, and get through the next year and a half without drawing attention to herself. She'd already been accepted to 3 colleges based on her academic record from California, and her plan was to disappear into higher education, where her background in martial arts might be seen as an interesting hobby rather than a potential threat to the established order. The first 2 weeks went exactly according to plan. Maya attended her classes, ate lunch alone while reading, and politely declined the few social invitations that came her way. She observed the complex social ecosystem of Jefferson High with the analytical mind her father had taught her to apply to combat situations, identifying the power players, understanding the unspoken rules, and mapping the territories where different groups held sway. Brandon Walsh ruled the school's social hierarchy with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to be at the top. At 17, he possessed the kind of natural charisma that made teachers overlook his academic shortcuts and administrators ignore his behavior problems. His father owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties. His mother sat on the school board, and his older brother had graduated from Jefferson High 5 years earlier before going on to play football at Duke University. Brandon's inner circle consisted of carefully chosen lieutenants who enhanced his power while never threatening it. There was Jake Morrison, whose family owned the local newspaper, and who served as Brandon's unofficial press secretary, controlling narratives and managing reputations with the skill of a seasoned politician. Tyler Adams brought muscle to the group, a linebacker whose size and willingness to use it made him invaluable for enforcing Brandon's will. And then there was Ashley Sterling, whose beauty and social connections made her the perfect complement to Brandon's leadership, a queen to his king in the elaborate theater of high school politics. Together, they formed a unit that had gone unchallenged for 3 years, accumulating power and privilege while systematically excluding or destroying anyone who threatened their dominance. Teachers who tried to hold them accountable found themselves facing pressure from parents and administrators. Students who resisted their authority discovered that life at Jefferson High could become very unpleasant very quickly. Maya might have continued flying under their radar indefinitely if not for the incident in advanced chemistry class during her 3rd week. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had assigned a complex lab project worth 30% of the semester grade, and students were required to work in pairs chosen by random selection. Maya found herself paired with Kevin Liu, a quiet sophomore whose academic brilliance was matched only by his social awkwardness. Kevin was exactly the kind of student Brandon's group loved to target: academically gifted but physically small, socially isolated but unwilling to compromise his principles for acceptance. He'd been dealing with their harassment for 2 years, enduring everything from casual insults to elaborate pranks that destroyed his belongings and humiliated him in front of the entire school. The chemistry project required partners to meet outside of class to complete research and prepare their presentation. Maya suggested they work in the library during lunch periods, a neutral territory where they could focus without interruption. Kevin agreed gratefully, clearly relieved to have a partner who took academics seriously and didn't seem interested in using the assignment as an opportunity for social maneuvering. Their first meeting went perfectly. Kevin proved to be not only brilliant, but genuinely passionate about chemistry, explaining complex molecular interactions with an enthusiasm that reminded Maya of her father discussing martial arts philosophy. Maya contributed her own strengths: organizational skills honed by years of disciplined training, and a work ethic that complemented Kevin's intellectual gifts perfectly. It was during their second meeting that Brandon's group discovered their collaboration. Maya and Kevin were deep in discussion about chemical bonding when Ashley Sterling appeared at their table, flanked by 2 other girls whose primary qualification For friendship seemed to be their willingness to laugh at Ashley's jokes and validate her opinions. "How sweet," Ashley announced loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. The charity case found herself a boyfriend. She examined Maya with the kind of calculating cruelty that came from years of practice identifying and exploiting weaknesses. "I have to admit I'm impressed. Most girls wait at least a month before settling for the bottom of the barrel, but you're really embracing efficiency." Kevin's face turned bright red, and Maya could see his hands trembling slightly as he tried to focus on his notes. She recognized the signs of someone who had endured this treatment before, who had learned that fighting back only made things worse, but couldn't quite suppress the humiliation and anger that came with being publicly degraded. "We're working on a chemistry project," Maya said calmly, her voice carrying none of the emotion she felt building in her chest. "Is there something you needed, or are you just practicing your stand-up routine?" The response surprised Ashley, who was clearly accustomed to her targets either cowering in fear or lashing out in ways that justified escalation. Maya's tone was polite but completely unimpressed, treating Ashley's performance like a mildly annoying interruption rather than a social catastrophe. "Oh, it talks back," one of Ashley's friends giggled, but Ashley herself looked uncertain for a moment before regaining her composure. "I was just wondering if you knew about Kevin's little problem," Ashley continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "See, he has this habit of getting so nervous around girls that he throws up." "Right, Kevin. Remember what happened at the spring dance when Sarah Martinez tried to be nice to you?" Kevin's face went from red to pale, and Maya could see his breathing, becoming shallow and rapid. She'd seen panic attacks before, had helped several of her father's younger students work through anxiety that could paralyze them during competitions. Without thinking, she reached over and placed her hand gently on Kevin's arm, a gesture that was both comforting and grounding. "Kevin," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same calm authority her father used when helping students regain control. "Look at me. Breathe slowly. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. You're okay." The technique worked exactly as it always had, Kevin's breathing gradually slowing as he followed Maya's instructions. The panic faded from his eyes, replaced by gratitude and something that looked like amazement that someone had actually helped him instead of either joining the attack or pretending not to notice. Ashley watched this interaction with growing irritation, clearly frustrated that her carefully orchestrated humiliation was being derailed by someone who refused to play by the established rules. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "The new girl thinks she can save everyone. I wonder how long that attitude will last when she realizes what happens to people who don't know their place around here." Maya looked up at Ashley with the same calm focus she'd learned to maintain during sparring sessions when facing opponents who relied on intimidation rather than skill. "I think I understand the situation perfectly," she said. "You're used to people being afraid of you, and you're confused because I'm not."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"That must be uncomfortable." The directness of Maya's response caught Ashley completely off guard. In her world, confrontations followed predictable patterns. Victims either submitted immediately or fought back in ways that justified escalation. Maya's approach, calm but completely unintimidated, didn't fit any of the scripts Ashley had memorized. "You don't know who you're messing with," Ashley said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "A girl who peaked in high school and is desperately trying to maintain relevance through elaborate bullying campaigns?" Maya asked with genuine curiosity. "Did I get that right?" The library had gone completely silent, students at nearby tables abandoning all pretense of studying to watch this unprecedented confrontation. Nobody talked to Ashley Sterling like that. Nobody challenged the established order so directly and calmly. Maya had just broken one of Jefferson High's most fundamental rules, and everyone knew there would be consequences. Ashley's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of public humiliation. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You have no idea what you've just started." "I started a chemistry study session," Maya replied matter-of-factly. "You're the one who decided to turn it into a performance piece. But if you're done with your routine, Kevin and I have work to finish." Ashley stood there for a moment longer, clearly struggling with how to respond to someone who refused to be intimidated or provoked into a reaction that would justify retaliation. Finally, she turned and stalked away, her friends trailing behind her like confused ducklings who couldn't quite understand what had just happened. Maya turned back to Kevin, who was staring at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. "That was incredible," he whispered. "But you don't understand what you've done. Ashley doesn't forget things like this. And when she tells Brandon what happened, then we'll deal with Brandon when the time comes," Maya said simply. "Right now, we have a project to finish. Can you walk me through the molecular structure? Again? I want to make sure I understand the bonding process correctly." For the next 30 minutes, they worked together as if nothing had happened, but Maya was acutely aware of the whispered conversations happening at tables throughout the library. Word of her confrontation with Ashley was spreading through the school's social network with the speed of wildfire, and she knew that by the end of the day, everyone at Jefferson High would know that the quiet new girl had just declared war on the established order. Maya walked home that afternoon with the same measured pace she brought to everything else, but her mind was already working through scenarios and possibilities. She'd hoped to avoid this kind of attention, but some lines couldn't be crossed without response. Watching Kevin struggle with a panic attack while his tormentor laughed had triggered something deep in her training and her character, the same instinct that had driven her father to stand up to those men in San Francisco. The Chen family lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in one of Millbrook's older complexes, a significant change from the spacious house they'd owned in California. Maya found her mother in the kitchen, grading papers from her evening literacy classes while preparing dinner, the kind of efficient multitasking that had become necessary since their financial situation changed. "How was school today, Linda?" Chen asked, looking up from a particularly challenging essay about community service requirements. "Interesting," Maya replied, settling into the chair across from her mother. "I think I might have made some enemies." Linda's pen stopped moving, and she gave Maya her full attention. After everything they'd been through in San Francisco, any mention of conflict triggered immediate concern. "What happened?" Maya explained. The library incident in careful detail, watching her mother's expression shift from worry to resignation, to something that looked almost like pride. When she finished, Linda was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. "You couldn't have just ignored it?" she asked finally, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "You know I couldn't," Maya said. "Dad taught me that there are some things you don't walk away from, even when walking away is safer. Watching someone have a panic attack while their bully laughs isn't one of those things." Linda sighed, a sound that carried the weight of every difficult decision they'd made over the past 2 years. "Your father's principles are what got us into trouble in the first place. Dad's principles are what made him worth respecting," Maya countered gently. What happened in San Francisco wasn't about being wrong or right. It was about people with power deciding they could take whatever they wanted from people without it. That doesn't mean standing up was a mistake. "And it doesn't mean standing up was worth the cost," Linda replied, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at her daughter, seeing so much of David in Maya's quiet determination and moral clarity. "I just want you to be safe. We came here to start over, to build a life where you don't have to fight just to exist peacefully." "I know, Mom, and I'm not looking for trouble. But trouble found me today, and I handled it the way Dad taught me to handle it, with dignity and without backing down from bullies." Linda reached across the table and took Maya's hand, noting the calluses that remained from years of martial arts training despite months without regular practice. If this escalates, if these kids try to hurt you, then they'll discover that the quiet new girl has some surprises, Maya said with a slight smile. I've been training my entire life for situations exactly like this. I know how to take care of myself. That evening, Maya went through her usual routine with extra intensity, running through forms and techniques in the apartment's small living room while her parents watched the news. The familiar movements calmed her mind and prepared her body, muscle memory awakening skills that had been dormant but never forgotten. Her father watched from his chair, his injured wrist resting on a pillow, and Maya could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was proud that she'd stood up for someone who needed protection. Part of him was terrified that she was walking down the same path that had cost their family everything. "You remember what I taught you about choosing your battles?" David asked during a brief pause in Maya's practice. "Fight only when you must, but when you must, fight to win," Maya recited, settling into a meditation pose on the living room carpet. "And you believe this was a battle you had to fight?" Maya considered the question seriously, reviewing the afternoon's events and her response to them. "I think it was a battle I had to prepare for," she said finally. "What happened today was just the opening move." Ashley Sterling isn't going to let this slide, and neither is Brandon Walsh once she tells him what happened. "I can either be ready for what comes next, or I can pretend it's not coming and get caught off guard." David nodded slowly, recognizing his own tactical thinking in his daughter's analysis. "Then we'd better make sure you're ready." For the next hour, father and daughter worked together on technique and strategy, David calling out scenarios, while Maya responded with appropriate defensive and offensive combinations. Despite his injured wrist, his knowledge was as sharp as ever, and he pushed Maya to think beyond individual techniques to comprehensive approaches that would end confrontations, quickly and decisively. "Remember," he said as they finished the session, "the goal is never to hurt someone. The goal is to make them understand that hurting you is impossible. Sometimes that requires demonstrating capability, but it should never require causing unnecessary damage." Maya bowed formally to her father, maintaining the traditional respect that had always characterized their training relationship. "Yes, Sensei." The next morning brought the first clear signs that Maya's confrontation with Ashley had triggered exactly the response she'd expected. Her locker, which she'd left perfectly organized the previous afternoon, had been broken into and vandalized. Her books were scattered across the floor, pages torn and covers defaced with crude drawings and insulting comments. Someone had poured what looked like chocolate milk into her backpack, soaking her notebooks and creating a sticky mess that would require replacing most of her supplies. Maya surveyed the damage with the same analytical calm she'd applied to Ashley's verbal assault, cataloging the destruction without allowing emotion to cloud her judgment. This was psychological warfare, designed to humiliate her and demonstrate the price of challenging the established hierarchy. It was also escalation, a clear signal that Brandon's group had moved beyond warnings to active harassment. "Oh my God, Maya, what happened?" Kevin Liu appeared beside her, his face pale with guilt and concern. "This is my fault. If I hadn't been such a coward yesterday, if I'd stood up for myself instead of letting you handle everything." "This isn't your fault," Maya said firmly, beginning to sort through the damaged materials to see what could be salvaged. "This is what bullies do when someone refuses to be intimidated. It's a tantrum disguised as retaliation." Kevin helped her gather the scattered books, his hands shaking slightly with anger and frustration. "It's not fair. You were just trying to help me, and now they're targeting you too. I should have warned you what they were like." "I knew what they were like," Maya replied, pulling chocolate milk-soaked papers from her backpack. "I just chose to believe that doing the right thing was more important than avoiding consequences." A crowd had gathered around Maya's locker, drawn by the obvious signs of vandalism and the opportunity to witness the latest drama in Jefferson High's ongoing social warfare. Maya could hear whispered conversations, students debating whether the new girl would back down now that she'd experienced the full force of Brandon's displeasure. "Miss Chen?" Assistant Principal Rodriguez appeared through the crowd, her expression professionally neutral but clearly concerned. "I need to speak with you about this incident." Maya followed Rodriguez to her office, acutely aware of the eyes tracking her movement through the hallways. She understood that this conversation would be as much about establishing precedent as addressing the vandalism. How the administration handled this situation would send a message about what kinds of behavior were acceptable and what kinds of students deserved protection. Rodriguez's office was a study in bureaucratic efficiency, filled with motivational posters and educational regulations that created an atmosphere of forced optimism and rigid compliance. She gestured for Maya to sit in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs across from her desk, then spent several minutes reviewing Maya's file on her computer. "You've been at Jefferson for 3 weeks," Rodriguez began. "And this is already the second incident involving you and conflicts with other students. Yesterday's confrontation in the library, now this vandalism. I'm concerned that you're having trouble adjusting to our school's social environment." Maya recognized the subtext immediately. Rodriguez was framing the situation as Maya's inability to adapt rather than addressing the systematic harassment she was experiencing. It was a classic administrative maneuver designed to make the victim responsible for solving problems created by perpetrators who were too politically protected to discipline directly. "I'm not having trouble adjusting," Maya said calmly. "I'm having trouble understanding why students are allowed to vandalize other students' property without consequences." "We don't know who was responsible for the damage to your locker," Rodriguez replied, though her tone suggested she knew exactly who was responsible and had no intention of investigating further. "Without witnesses or evidence, there's not much we can do beyond filing a report and reminding students about our policies regarding school property." "There are security cameras in the hallways," Maya pointed out. "Surely they would show who accessed my locker after hours." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping Maya wouldn't pursue that line of reasoning. "The cameras in that section of the hallway have been experiencing technical difficulties. Unfortunately, we don't have footage from yesterday evening." Maya nodded, understanding that the technical difficulties were likely as convenient as they were temporary. She was beginning to recognize the patterns of institutional protection that allowed certain students to operate with impunity, while their victims were encouraged to accept their situation and move on. "I see," Maya said. "So your advice is to ignore the vandalism and hope it doesn't happen again?" "My advice is to focus on your studies and avoid situations that might lead to further conflicts," Rodriguez replied. "Jefferson High has a wonderful community of students who support each other and create positive learning environments. I'm sure once you find your place in that community, these kinds of problems will resolve themselves." Maya left the meeting with a clear understanding of where things stood. The administration would not protect her from Brandon's harassment, either because they couldn't challenge his family's influence or because they genuinely believed that victims should solve their own problems by changing their behavior rather than expecting perpetrators to face consequences. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, but Maya could feel the tension building throughout the school. Students whispered and pointed, teachers watched her with mixture of sympathy and concern, and Brandon's group maintained a visible presence wherever she went, making sure she understood that they were always watching and waiting for the next opportunity to demonstrate their power. Lunch period arrived with the kind of electric anticipation that preceded major confrontations. Maya had planned to eat in the library again, continuing her strategy of avoiding unnecessary contact with the school's social hierarchies. But Kevin intercepted her in the hallway outside the cafeteria. "Don't go to the library," he said urgently, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Ashley's been telling everyone that you're too scared to show your face in public. She's trying to make it look like you're hiding because you know you messed up yesterday." Maya considered this information, recognizing the tactical implications. Ashley was attempting to control the narrative, positioning Maya's avoidance of confrontation as evidence of weakness rather than wisdom. If Maya continued to avoid public spaces, Ashley would claim victory and use that perceived triumph to justify escalating harassment. "She's forcing me into a position where I have to engage," Maya realized. "Either I hide and prove I'm weak, or I show up and give her another opportunity to humiliate me in front of an audience." "That's exactly what she's doing," Kevin confirmed. "But Maya, you don't understand how vicious she can be when she has a crowd. Last year, she convinced half the school that Jenny Morrison was bulimic, just because Jenny refused to let Ashley copy her homework. Jenny ended up transferring to a private school because the rumors destroyed her friendships and her reputation." Maya looked through the cafeteria windows at the complex social ecosystem inside, identifying territories and power structures with the tactical awareness her father had taught her to apply to any potentially hostile environment. She could see Brandon's table at the center of the room, positioned so that its occupants could observe and influence everything happening around them. Ashley sat beside Brandon, occasionally pointing toward the entrance as if expecting someone to arrive. "They're waiting for me," Maya observed. "Ashley's already set the stage for whatever she has planned." "Please, just eat lunch somewhere else," Kevin pleaded. "I know it feels like giving up, but sometimes avoiding a fight is the smartest thing you can do." Maya understood Kevin's concern, and part of her agreed with his reasoning. The wise, tactical choice was to avoid engagement until she had better intelligence about her opponent's capabilities and intentions. But Maya also understood that some battles became inevitable, regardless of how carefully you tried to avoid them, and that choosing the timing and location of confrontation was often more important than avoiding confrontation entirely. "Kevin," she said gently, "what happens tomorrow when Ashley decides I'm an easy target because I backed down today? What happens next week when Brandon realizes he can do whatever he wants to me because I'm too afraid to fight back? Sometimes avoiding one fight just guarantees that you'll face 10 more fights later." Kevin looked stricken, clearly torn between wanting to protect Maya and knowing that she was probably right about the long-term consequences of appearing weak. "Just promise me you'll be careful. These people have destroyed lives for less than what you did yesterday." Maya checked her watch, noting that lunch period had started 5 minutes ago. By now, the cafeteria would be full, and Ashley would have had time to position her audience for maximum impact. If Maya was going to face whatever was coming, she might as well do it on her own terms. "I'll be careful," she promised Kevin. "But I won't be a victim." Maya entered the cafeteria with the measured confidence that came from years of walking into competitions where every opponent was studying her for signs of weakness or uncertainty. She moved through the lunch line efficiently, selecting a simple meal that she could eat quickly if necessary, her eyes constantly scanning the room for potential threats and exit routes. Brandon's table had indeed become the center of attention, with students from surrounding tables clearly positioning themselves to observe whatever entertainment Ashley had planned. Maya could see phones being discreetly positioned for recording, the modern equivalent of a crowd gathering for a public execution. Maya chose a table near the center of the room, close enough to Brandon's group that she couldn't be accused of hiding, but far enough away that she had time to react if they decided to approach. She sat with her back to the wall, another habit from her martial arts training that ensured she could see threats coming from any direction. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Maya ate her lunch calmly while pretending to review notes from her morning classes, but she was acutely aware of the growing tension in the room. Students kept glancing between her table and Brandon's, clearly expecting some kind of confrontation, but uncertain when or how it would begin. Ashley was the first to move, rising from her chair with the theatrical grace of someone who knew she was being watched by dozens of eyes. She said something to Brandon that made him smile, then began walking across the cafeteria with 2 of her friends flanking her like bodyguards. Maya continued reading her notes as Ashley approached, but every muscle in her body was coiled and ready to respond. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments in any confrontation were the seconds before violence began, when opponents were still testing boundaries and looking for opportunities to gain advantage through surprise or intimidation. "Well, well," Ashley announced as she reached Maya's table, her voice pitched loud enough to carry across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Look who decided to show her face after all. I was starting to think yesterday's little performance was just beginner's luck." Maya looked up from her notes with polite interest, as if Ashley's arrival was a mildly curious interruption rather than the opening move in a carefully choreographed attack. "Is there something I can help you with, Ashley?" The calm response clearly frustrated Ashley, who had expected either fear or anger that would justify escalation. Instead, Maya's tone was professionally courteous, treating Ashley like a customer service inquiry rather than a social threat. "Actually, there is something you can help me with," Ashley said, settling into the chair across from Maya without invitation. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized I might have been too subtle. Sometimes people from different backgrounds need things explained more directly." Maya closed her notebook and gave Ashley her full attention, recognizing that they had reached the point where pretending to ignore the situation was no longer possible. "I'm listening." Ashley leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice carrying just far enough to include the nearby tables in her audience. "See, Jefferson High has traditions that go back decades, ways of doing things that keep everything running smoothly. And one of those traditions is that new students, especially scholarship students, spend their first year learning how things work before they start trying to change anything." "That's interesting," Maya replied. "And what exactly am I supposed to be learning?" "Respect," Ashley said, her fake friendliness beginning to slip. "Respect for students who've earned their place here. Respect for social structures that exist for good reasons. Respect for people who understand this school better than some outsider who's been here for 5 minutes." Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Ashley's words seriously. "So, your position is that I should show respect to people based on how long they've attended school here, rather than on their actions or character?" "My position is that you should show respect to people who deserve it," Ashley snapped, her composure cracking under Maya's continued refusal to be intimidated. "People whose families built this community. People who belong here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya could feel the entire cafeteria holding its breath. Ashley had just crossed the line from personal conflict to something much more serious, making the kind of statement about belonging and worthiness that revealed the underlying prejudices driving her behavior. Maya stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Ashley," she said quietly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You seem to believe that respect is something you inherit, like a trust fund or a family name. But where I come from, respect is something you earn through your actions, your integrity, and how you treat people who can't defend themselves." Ashley rose as well, her friends moving to flank her in a formation, clearly designed to intimidate. "And where exactly do you come from?" "Because it obviously wasn't anywhere that taught you proper manners." Maya smiled, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. "I come from a place where people learn the difference between confidence and arrogance, between leadership and bullying, between earning respect and demanding it because daddy bought you a parking spot." The insult hit its target perfectly, Ashley's face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. She'd built her entire identity around the privileges that came with her family's status, and Maya had just stripped away the veneer of legitimacy she used to justify her behavior. "You don't know anything about me," Ashley said, her voice shaking slightly with rage. "I know everything about you," Maya replied calmly. "You're a small person trying to feel big by making other people feel small. You're terrified that without daddy's money and mommy's connections, nobody would have any reason to pay attention to you. And you're so insecure about your own worth that you spend your time attacking people you see as threats to your manufactured superiority." Ashley's hand moved faster than most people would have expected, swinging in a wild slap aimed at Maya's face. But Maya had been watching Ashley's body language, reading the tension in her shoulders and the shift in her weight that preceded the attack. She moved her head slightly to the left, letting Ashley's hand pass harmlessly through the air, where her cheek had been a split second earlier. The miss threw Ashley off balance, and Maya could have easily countered with a strike that would have ended the confrontation immediately. Instead, she caught Ashley's wrist gently, applying just enough pressure to demonstrate control without causing pain. "I don't think you want to do that," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that made several nearby students unconsciously step back. Ashley tried to pull free, but Maya's grip was immovable, held in place by years of training that had taught her to control opponents without harming them. For the first time since the confrontation began, Ashley looked genuinely afraid, finally understanding that she had challenged someone far more dangerous than she'd realized. "Let go of me," Ashley demanded, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Maya released Ashley's wrist immediately, stepping back to create space between them. "Of course. I wouldn't want anyone to think I was the kind of person who hurts people who can't defend themselves." The implication was crystal clear, and Ashley's face went white with humiliation and rage. Maya had just demonstrated superior physical capability, while simultaneously highlighting the moral difference between them, making Ashley look both weak and cruel in front of the entire cafeteria. That's when Brandon Walsh decided to involve himself directly. Maya heard him coming before she saw him, her peripheral vision catching his movement as he rose from his table with the kind of aggressive swagger that indicated he'd finally found an excuse to demonstrate his dominance. Brandon was used to solving problems through physical intimidation, and Ashley's public humiliation represented a challenge to his authority that couldn't go unanswered. "Is there a problem here?" Brandon asked, positioning himself between Maya and Ashley in a display of protective masculinity that was clearly intended to impress his audience. "No problem at all," Maya replied evenly. "Ashley and I were just having a discussion about respect and manners. Very educational." Brandon stepped closer to Maya, using his height advantage to loom over her in a display of physical dominance that had intimidated countless students over the years. At 6'2" and carrying the muscle mass of a dedicated athlete, he represented exactly the kind of opponent most people would choose to avoid. But Maya saw something different when she looked at Brandon Walsh. She saw someone who had never faced real resistance, never learned to fight against anyone who could fight back, never developed skills beyond raw intimidation and inherited authority. "I think you owe Ashley an apology," Brandon said, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone accustomed to having his suggestions treated as commands. "She was trying to help you understand how things work around here, and you responded with threats and violence." Maya almost smiled at the audacity of the reframing. In Brandon's world, Ashley's attempted slap was apparently invisible, while Maya's defensive response constituted unprovoked aggression. It was a masterclass in manipulating narratives, the kind of skill that came from years of avoiding consequences through creative interpretation of events. "I see," Maya said thoughtfully. "So when Ashley tried to hit me, that was helpful guidance. But when I prevented her from hitting me, that was violence. Do I have that right?" Several students in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the logical inconsistency, but uncertain whether pointing it out was worth risking Brandon's displeasure. Maya had just highlighted the absurdity of his position while maintaining perfect composure, a combination that made him look both unreasonable and ineffective. Brandon's jaw tightened, and Maya could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He'd expected her to either apologize immediately or respond with the kind of emotional outburst that would justify escalation. Instead, she was calmly dismantling his authority in front of dozens of witnesses, making him look foolish while giving him no legitimate excuse for retaliation. "Don't try to twist this around," Brandon said, stepping even closer. You came into our school, disrupted our community, and now you're causing problems for students who've been nothing but welcoming. That ends today." Maya held her ground. As Brandon invaded her personal space, a violation that was clearly intended to trigger fight-or-flight responses that would either make her back down or lash out. But years of sparring with opponents who were bigger, stronger, and more experienced had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to think tactically even when adrenaline was flooding her system. "Welcoming," Maya repeated, as if testing the word. "Is that what you call vandalizing someone's locker? Spreading rumors? Attempting physical assault? Because where I come from, we have different words for those behaviors." The crowd was clearly engaged now, drawn by the rare spectacle of someone challenging Brandon's authority with logic rather than aggression. Maya could see phones recording the confrontation, documenting every word and gesture for later dissection on social media. The court of public opinion was in session, and she was winning. Brandon recognized the shift in momentum and decided to escalate before he lost control of the situation entirely. "You know what? Maybe you need a more direct lesson in respect." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, holding it up like a prize. "New girl here looks like she could use some lunch money. Maybe we should take up a collection for the charity case." The gesture was calculated humiliation, designed to reduce Maya to the status of a beggar while positioning Brandon as a generous benefactor. Several of his friends laughed and reached for their wallets, clearly prepared to participate in what they saw as harmless fun rather than systematic degradation. "That's very generous," Maya said, her voice remaining perfectly level despite the rage building in her chest. "But I think there's been another misunderstanding." Brandon held the money closer to her face, his smile containing all the warmth of a predator playing with wounded prey. "No misunderstanding. You look hungry, and we're offering to help. All you have to do is ask nicely." Maya looked at the money, then at Brandon's expectant face, then at the crowd of students waiting to see how she would respond to this ultimate test of her dignity. She could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that her next words would determine not just her own status at Jefferson High, but the message sent to every future target of Brandon's campaigns. "Brandon," she said quietly, "I think you're confused about something important." Before he could respond, Maya moved with the fluid precision that came from years of training. Her left hand swept upward, deflecting Brandon's outstretched arm, while her right hand captured his wrist in a grip that immediately took control of his entire arm. The movement was so smooth and fast that most observers didn't even see it happen. But suddenly Brandon was off balance and completely helpless. Maya applied pressure to specific points on Brandon's wrist, utilizing techniques her father had taught her for controlling opponents without causing permanent damage. Brandon's hand opened involuntarily, the $5 bill fluttering to the ground as his arm went numb from fingers to elbow. "The confusion," Maya continued conversationally, as if she wasn't currently immobilizing the school's most feared bully, "is thinking that I'm someone who can be bought, intimidated, or controlled." Brandon tried to pull free, but Maya's grip was technically perfect, using leverage and pressure points that made resistance impossible regardless of size or strength differences. His face went red as he realized that struggling only made the hold more painful, while every second of helplessness was being witnessed and recorded by dozens of his classmates. "Let go of me," Brandon demanded, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Of course," Maya said, immediately releasing his arm. "I wouldn't want anyone to think I was the kind of person who holds people against their will." Brandon stumbled backward, cradling his arm and staring at Maya with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. In 30 seconds, she had completely reversed their positions, demonstrating superior skill while maintaining perfect control and ethical high ground. The cafeteria had gone completely silent, 200 students processing what they had just witnessed. Brandon Walsh, unopposed king of Jefferson High's social hierarchy, had been effortlessly neutralized by the quiet new girl who supposedly didn't belong in their world. Maya bent down and picked up the dropped $5 bill, smoothing it carefully. Before approaching Brandon, "You dropped this," she said, offering him the money with the same polite courtesy she might show to an elderly neighbor. Brandon stared at the bill like it was a snake, clearly recognizing that accepting it would complete his humiliation, while refusing it would make him look petty and small. After a long moment, he snatched the money from her hand, his face burning with embarrassment and suppressed rage. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Maya smiled, the expression containing no malice but absolute confidence. "Yes, it is, because now you know something you didn't know 5 minutes ago." "What's that?" "You know that I'm not afraid of you. You know that I won't be intimidated, bought, or controlled. And you know that if you try to hurt me or anyone under my protection, you'll face consequences that Daddy's money can't fix." The phrase "anyone under my protection" sent ripples through the crowd, as students realized that Maya wasn't just defending herself, but extending that protection to others. Kevin Liu, still standing near the entrance to the cafeteria, felt tears of gratitude and relief welling up in his eyes. Brandon looked around the cafeteria, taking in the faces of students who had witnessed his defeat and would spread the story throughout the school within hours. His reign of unchallenged authority was over, undermined not by rebellion or violence, but by someone who had simply refused to accept his manufactured superiority. "Come on," he said to Ashley and his remaining supporters. "Let's get out of here." As Brandon's group retreated, the cafeteria erupted in conversation. Students who had suffered under his harassment for years suddenly felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if a weight that had pressed down on everyone had suddenly been lifted. Maya had proven that the emperor had no clothes, that power based on fear and intimidation could be challenged by someone with real strength and moral courage. Maya sat back down at her table and resumed eating her lunch, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. But students continued to approach her throughout the remainder of the period, offering thanks, asking questions, and simply wanting to be associated with someone who had accomplished the impossible. Kevin Liu was among the first to reach her table, his face glowing with admiration and disbelief. "Maya, that was incredible. I've never seen anyone handle Brandon like that. How did you learn to do that?" "My father taught me that real strength isn't about hurting people," Maya replied. "It's about protecting them, including protecting bullies from themselves when they don't realize how far they've fallen." The rest of the school day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. News of the cafeteria confrontation spread through Jefferson High's social networks faster than wildfire, growing in the telling until Maya's measured response became an epic triumph of good over evil. Teachers who had tolerated Brandon's behavior for years suddenly found themselves questioning why they had allowed fear of his family's influence to compromise their professional obligations. Students who had accepted harassment as an inevitable part of high school life began wondering if change was actually possible. Maya's final class of the day was advanced physics, taught by Mr. Chen, an elderly teacher whose stern demeanor concealed a deep respect for intellectual honesty and moral courage. As students filed into the classroom, Maya could feel the weight of their attention and expectation. "Miss Chen," Mr. Chen said as she took her seat, "I understand you had an eventful lunch period." "It was educational," Maya replied diplomatically. Mr. Chen smiled, the first time most students had ever seen such an expression on his face. "Indeed, sometimes the most important lessons happen outside of textbooks." The physics lesson that followed was a study in applied force, momentum, and leverage, concepts that Maya had just demonstrated in practical application. Mr. Chen's examples seemed chosen specifically to reinforce the lessons of the afternoon, illustrating how technique and knowledge could overcome raw power when properly applied. After class, Maya walked to her locker to gather her things for the trip home. The hallway that had seemed hostile that morning now felt different, charged with possibility rather than threat. Students nodded respectfully as she passed, and several stopped to thank her for standing up to Brandon. At her locker, Maya found an envelope that had been slipped through the vents. Inside was a note written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for showing us that bullies aren't invincible. You've given hope to people who thought they had to accept being victims forever. If you ever need anything, you have more friends than you know." The note was unsigned, but Maya suspected it represented the feelings of dozens of students who had suffered in silence for years. She carefully folded the paper and put it in her backpack, understanding that she had accidentally become a symbol of resistance and change. Maya's walk home took her through Millbrook's quiet residential neighborhoods, past houses that represented the kind of stable, peaceful life her family had sacrificed in San Francisco. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, creating the kind of picture-perfect scene that belonged on postcards advertising small-town American values. Her parents were waiting when she arrived at their apartment, having heard about the day's events through the efficient communication networks that connected all school employees. Linda Chen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, while David Chen paced slowly around the living room, his injured wrist preventing the more vigorous movement that usually accompanied his anxiety. "So," Linda began carefully, "I received some interesting phone calls this afternoon." Maya set down her backpack and joined her mother at the table, recognizing that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment she decided to confront Ashley Sterling. "What kind of phone calls?" "3 different teachers wanted to make sure I knew what a remarkable young woman I was raising," Linda said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern. "2 parents called to thank you for standing up to bullies who had been tormenting their children. And Principal Martinez wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss recent events and their impact on school climate." David stopped pacing and turned to face his daughter. "Maya, tell us exactly what happened. Leave nothing out." Maya recounted the day's events in careful detail, from the vandalized locker through the cafeteria confrontation and its aftermath. Her parents listened without interruption, occasionally exchanging glances that contained entire conversations about consequences and possibilities. When she finished, the apartment was quiet, except for the distant sounds of traffic and neighbors going about their evening routines. David sat down across from Maya, his expression thoughtful and proud. "You handled it perfectly," he said finally. "You demonstrated strength without cruelty, defended principles without compromising them, and showed mercy to someone who didn't deserve it, but desperately needed it." "But," Linda interjected, "you've also painted a target on your back. Brandon Walsh isn't going to forget what happened today, and his family has resources that could make our lives very difficult." Maya nodded, understanding her mother's concerns, but also recognizing that some choices were inevitable regardless of their consequences. "Mom, what was the alternative? Let Ashley hit me and hope they eventually got bored with having a victim who wouldn't fight back? Stand by while they terrorized Kevin and other kids who remind them of their own insecurities? The alternative was keeping your head down and graduating without incident," Linda said, but her tone suggested she already knew that option had never really existed. "That's not who you raised me to be," Maya replied gently. "And it's not who Dad trained me to be. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when standing up is dangerous." David reached across the table and placed his uninjured hand over Maya's. "Your mother's worried because she loves you and wants you to be safe. I'm worried for the same reasons, but I'm also proud because you've proven that all those years of training weren't just about technique. They were about character." The evening passed quietly, with Maya completing homework while her parents discussed the potential ramifications of the day's events. They agreed that Principal Martinez's meeting would likely focus on damage control, ensuring that the incident didn't escalate into larger problems that could attract media attention or legal challenges. Maya went to bed that night with a sense of completion rather than victory. She hadn't set out to become a symbol or leader, but circumstances had forced her into a role she was uniquely qualified to fill. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and consequences, but she faced them with the confidence that came from knowing she had acted according to her principles rather than her fears. The next morning brought surprising developments. Maya arrived at school to find that her locker had been repaired and restocked with new supplies, courtesy of an anonymous donor, who had also left a note expressing appreciation for her courage. Several teachers greeted her warmly, and students who had never spoken to her before offered friendship and support. Most surprisingly, Brandon Walsh was nowhere to be seen. Word spread quickly that he had been suspended pending an investigation into the vandalism incident, which had apparently been captured on security cameras that were mysteriously functional when administrators actually bothered to check them. Ashley Sterling attended classes but kept a low profile, clearly understanding that her association with Brandon had become a liability rather than an asset. Without her primary protector, she found herself isolated and vulnerable, experiencing, for the first time, the social exile she had imposed on so many others. The transformation of Jefferson High's social atmosphere wasn't immediate or complete, but it was undeniable. Students who had accepted harassment as inevitable began reporting incidents to teachers who suddenly felt empowered to take action. Academic performance improved as stress levels decreased. The cafeteria became a place where students from different social groups could interact without fear of retribution. Maya's meeting with Principal Martinez went better than expected. Rather than attempting to discipline her for the confrontation, Martinez asked for her input on developing new policies to address bullying and create more inclusive school environments. Maya found herself appointed to a student advisory committee charged with recommending systemic changes. Over the following weeks, Maya watched Jefferson High slowly transform from a place where might made right to a community where character and integrity were valued above social status and inherited privilege. The change wasn't universal, and resistance came from students and parents who benefited from the old systems, but progress was undeniable. Kevin Liu blossomed under the protection Maya had promised, discovering confidence and social connections that had been impossible when he lived in constant fear. Other students who had suffered in silence found their voices, creating a support network that made future harassment both more difficult and less effective. Maya never sought recognition for her role in these changes, preferring to focus on her studies and her renewed martial arts training with her father. But she understood that sometimes a single moment of courage could inspire others to find their own strength, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original action. Brandon Walsh returned to school after a 2-week suspension, chastened by consequences he had never previously faced and therapy sessions that had forced him to confront the destructive nature of his behavior. He avoided Maya entirely, focusing on rebuilding relationships with teammates and classmates who had begun to distance themselves from his toxic leadership. Maya's story spread beyond Jefferson High, inspiring students at other schools who faced similar challenges. She received letters from teenagers across the country who had found the courage to stand up to their own bullies after hearing about the quiet new girl who had refused to be intimidated by money, status, or physical threats. College admissions officers took notice not just of Maya's academic achievements, but of her leadership and character, leading to scholarship offers from universities that valued integrity as much as test scores. Her essays about overcoming adversity and protecting others resonated with readers who recognized authentic courage when they encountered it. Years later, Maya would look back on that October afternoon in Jefferson High's cafeteria as a defining moment, not because of the confrontation itself, but because of the choice she made to prioritize principles over safety. She had learned that real strength wasn't about defeating enemies, but about protecting friends. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. And that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with fists, but with character. The $5 bill Brandon had tried to force on her remained in Maya's wallet as a reminder of the day she discovered that some things could never be bought, sold, or taken away by force. Respect earned through integrity was permanent in ways that respect demanded through intimidation could never be. And the knowledge that she had made a difference in other people's lives was worth more than any amount of money or social status. Maya Chen had entered Jefferson High as a victim in waiting, a target marked by her outsider status and apparent vulnerability. She left as a legend, proof that courage and principle could triumph over privilege and power when wielded by someone who understood the difference between strength and violence, between leadership and dominance, between earning respect and demanding it. The revolution that began with a single moment of defiance had transformed not just a school, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when people chose to stand up rather than stand by. And in the end, that was a victory that no amount of money or influence could ever take away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.